This series was voted on and made possible by my contributors on Subscribestar. See folks, voting really does matter, so join up. For the Fianna, the World Wars unleashed horrors that they hadn't seen since they'd fought the Fomori in the Age of Myth. In World Wars I and II, all that was wrong with industrial civilization, this toxic love child of the weaver and the worm, burst forth in all its terrible fruition. And with so much death and destruction and misery in the air, Banes flourished and the black spirals infested the continent as never before. Though many Fianna did cross the channel to serve in both conflicts, most of the tribe focused on defending their cairns at home. It was the worm howlers that most concerned them, not petty human politics. Their kinfolk fought just as bravely as the full-blooded Guru. The most noteworthy individual, as the Fianna liked to claim, was T.E. Lawrence, as in Lawrence of Arabia. Born in Carnarvonshire, Wales, the son of an Anglo-Irish baronet. It was perhaps just as well that so many of the Fianna chose to remain close to home, as once again strife and suffering struck at their tribal heartland in the British Isles. Restless nationalism had been growing in Ireland, especially ever since the Act of Union of 1800, where Ireland was formally and legally absorbed into the United Kingdom. Yet despite now being a sovereign part of the UK, Great Britain continued to treat Ireland and the Irish people like a colony to be exploited. And when some Irish, sick to the back teeth of this treatment, lashed out in violence, the Fianna were more than willing to help them, albeit from the shadows. Once again, though, this served to create another rift between the Irish Fianna and the British Fianna. There was talk of granting Ireland home rule, except the Protestants in Ulster refused to accept being ruled over by the Catholic majority. The UK Parliament was on the verge of passing the Irish Home Rule Bill in 1914, and the Ulsterites had mustered 100,000 volunteers to literally fight that decision when World War I broke out and the whole matter was put on hold. But the boiling tensions driven by nationalism and centuries of religious strife couldn't be ignored forever. And so, in the middle of World War I, in 1916, the famous Easter Rising broke out. The British authorities quickly squashed that and executed all their leaders, whose ghosts are said to haunt the site of the Dublin General Post Office, according to many Fianna theurges. Guerrilla war between the Catholics in the south and the Protestants in the north continued until 1922, when Parliament granted home rule to the Catholic south, allowing Northern Ireland to remain under the authority of their fellow Protestant British. However, that's not to say that Great Britain was immune from trouble during the World Wars. The ferocious bombing raids inflicted by the Germans during the Blitz of World War II not only killed millions and devastated cities, it also inflicted terrible supernatural scars upon the umbral landscape of the island. Countless spiritual craters became nests for the most horrific of banes. It would take decades and the loss of many werewolf lives in order to clear them out. And even then, the terrible resonance of the Blitz still lingers in the British Umbra into the modern nights. Things settled down for a little while in the first decades of the Cold War, but like so many such pieces, it proved all too brief. Despite the independence of Catholic Ireland being recognized in 1949 by the UK, hostility and tensions between the Catholic South and the Protestant remnant of Northern Ireland continued to smolder, finally breaking out into violence in the late 60s, early 70s with the Troubles. Now, kinfolk fighting kinfolk is nothing new to the Fianna. In fact, it's a depressingly familiar part of their history. However, no matter how many times this had happened in the past, the Fianna had always kept themselves out of it. After all, that had been part of the agreement with the Silver Fangs after the Norman conquest. And to be fair, whatever else the Fangs had done over the centuries, they had kept their part of the bargain. Never once did they try to claim any Irish cairns. And so the Fianna had done their best to hold up their end and stay out of human politics as much as possible. There had always been exceptions, of course, individual Fianna unwilling to stand by as family members were harmed, even if those family members were harmed by some other tribe mate's family members. Unfortunately, what made the Troubles different is that this time, strife between the human kinfolk led to mass conflict among the Fianna themselves, a kind of mini-civil war between werewolves. In order to understand how this happened, I must first begin by explaining the camps of the Fianna tribe. As I've stated in a previous video, I'm not particularly fond of the idea of the camps, mostly because they generally tend to be thinly veiled, oh, you can play as Tribe A while also technically being Tribe B, which kind of undermines the idea of different tribes in the first place. Though admittedly, the Fianna aren't quite as bad in this regard. For example, there are the Songkeepers, arguably the very oldest of the Fianna camps, claiming to trace their origins back to the very first Fianna, that werewolf born of the union between a Guru and Danu of the Tuatha De Danann. Comprised mostly of galliards, with some theurges and philodoxes thrown in, the principal duty of the Songkeepers is to preserve and keep alive the story and tradition of the Fianna. The galliards memorize, sing, and recite the old stories and songs. They also tend to be among the best singers of the Fianna. Meanwhile, the theurges preserve and practice the ancient rites, while the philodoxes preserve and pass on all of the tribe's oldest laws and customs. The Songkeepers, in essence, are the living memory of the Fianna. But the Fianna are warriors as much as they are bards, and there are at least two very strong militant camps within the tribe, the Brotherhood of Herne and the Grandchildren of Finn. The Brotherhood traces its origins to the Dark Ages, when the Fianna were launching their campaign to cleanse Scotland of the recently fallen Black Spiral Dancers. So many were required to fight their corrupted cousins that many cairns were left lightly or even undefended completely. Since cairns are regarded as sacred by werewolves, this was intolerable, and so the Brotherhood, mostly comprised of Arun, was created as a kind of rapid response force. Whenever a sept is in danger, members of the Brotherhood will moonbridge into the defended cairn in order to fight whatever is threatening it. The Grandchildren of Finn, meanwhile, come from an older warrior tradition. Named in honor of Finn MacCool, Irish folk hero and greatest of the Fianna's human kinfolk, the Grandchildren are comprised mostly of young, newly inducted Guru, restless and hungering for glory. They emulate the example of Finn and his warband of followers, traveling the world in search of foes to fight and opportunities to tell stories of previous victories. Inevitably, most members of the Grandchildren of Finn grow older and start favoring the comforts of hearth and home. But even in the modern nights, with numbers of werewolves dropping, there always seem to be plenty of young bloods ready to refill the ranks of the camp. The Children of Dire is a camp comprised almost entirely of Fianna lupus. Their principal job is to keep watch over the few remaining untouched wild places in Fianna territory, while also safeguarding the vanishingly small number of wolf kinfolk that the Fianna have left to them. Meanwhile, the Tuatha De Finn is a camp comprised essentially of diplomats, serving as intermediaries between their tribe mates and the changelings. A difficult and generally thankless job, as the changelings and werewolves think very, very differently from one another and very rarely see eye to eye in the modern nights. The last two camps unfortunately do betray that lazy writing that I mentioned earlier. The Whispering Rovers, a camp of Hamid and a few Metis Fianna, are messengers and spies that are often considered unwelcome by other tribes, especially when they arrive unannounced at their cairns, making them essentially the Fianna equivalent of the Silent Striders. Meanwhile, the Mother's Fundamentalists are essentially a faction of Fianna that want to bring back the Impergium, essentially making them Red Talons in all but name. Both camps are even compared directly to the Striders and Talons respectively in the revised tribe book. It's like White Wolf was just admitting to its own lazy writing. With all that finally out of the way, the Mother's Fundamentalists were the principal reason why the Fianna got dragged directly into the Troubles. Given their pro-Impergium stance, the Mother's Fundamentalists saw the Troubles as a great opportunity. After all, how better to cull humanity than to get them to kill each other? Calling themselves the Era Fundamentalists back then, they got busily to work on both sides of the conflict. They first instigated attacks on the Unionists in Northern Ireland. This caused the Brotherhood of Hearn to intervene, mainly because, thanks to their deep ties to Scotland and thus the Ulster Plantation, the Brotherhood of Hearn boasts a lot of kinfolk that have been very pro-British. Of course, when the Brotherhood then intervened to protect their human kin in Northern Ireland, the Mothers Fundamentalists proceeded to cast them and their kin as lackeys of the British government, crushing the poor Irish. A narrative they then proceeded to feed to both Irish Republican kinfolk and Irish kinfolk in the diaspora, especially in the United States, which in turn caused many of those kinfolk to then throw themselves into the meat grinder. And because of the grandchildren of Finn's strong cultural ties to Ireland and the many Irish kinfolk they have, that camp also got dragged into the fight on the Republican side. As you can imagine, especially after their role in the Troubles came to light, the fundies, as they are disparagingly called, are roundly hated by the rest of the Fianna. If it weren't for the fact that the camp shows no sign of worm corruption, they likely would have been wiped out decades ago. But even as the tribe elders tried to keep the kinfolk and their hot-blooded tribe mates from killing each other, affairs were afoot in the wider world. After centuries of increasing banality, the moon landing in 1969 inspired such a massive upsurge in the dreaming that the old pathways, or trods, to the spirit world were reopened, and the Fey nobility, which had fled the Autumn Realm during the Shattering, returned. Unfortunately, this reunion proved to be a curse in disguise. This nobility, comprised mostly of the so-called Arcadian Sidhe, simply expected the commoner kith to fall back in line and pay obeisance to them. Given that the commoners had essentially been abandoned by the Arcadian Sidhe during the Shattering and had been governing themselves for the last few centuries, this was something they deeply resented. And so began the secret conflict known as the Accordance War, as the Arcadian Sidhe, steeped for centuries in the endless possibility of the dreaming, used their superior magic to try and subdue the more numerous commoner kiths, as well as those Sidhe that had remained in the human world after the Shattering, and thus sided with the commoners, the so-called Autumn Sidhe. And just as the Troubles lasted for decades, only ending with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, the Accordance War only ended in the last decades of the 20th century with the emergence of a leader powerful enough to force both sides to make peace: High King David Ardry. But of course, the end of fighting did not mean the end of troubles for the Fianna. Ireland had always been one of the poorer countries in Europe. However, between the middle of the 90s and 2008, the country experienced an unprecedented economic boom known as the Celtic Tiger. There are several reasons for this uptick in prosperity, but one of the big ones often cited is the fact that Ireland, as an EU member, received large subsidies from the European Union, as well as massive injections of investment capital. At the height of the Celtic Tiger, the Irish economy was growing at a rate of 10% per year, and the average living standards of Irishmen increased dramatically. Unfortunately for the Werewolves, Ireland's gain proved to be Gaia's loss. Irish cities swelled in size and population. Large swaths of once pristine hill country and forests were developed. With the arrival of tech companies like Intel from America, the Irish countryside became crisscrossed by transmission lines and cellular towers. After all those centuries of fighting against the worm, it turns out that the Weaver has now become the biggest threat to Irish Fianna. And it's not just the physical landscape that's been affected. According to a young galliard who was traveling through the Umbra near County Cork, she saw a new kind of spirit beast, which appeared to be a giant tiger made of spider webs wound together like Celtic knotwork. The Celtic tiger so impacted Ireland that it may have created its own spiritual avatar. And with all the spider webs, it is clearly a thing of the Weaver. And that does not bode well for the servants of the wild. That's not to say that the worm was idle during the final decades of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st. Two more massive attacks led by the Black Spiral Dancers and including several Banes have been made upon Silver Tara, one in 1976, the other in 2000. Both times the Fianna successfully repelled the worm howlers and their malignant helpers, but both times at great cost. Both times the Fianna only won because the Ard Rí employed an ancient and powerful fetish, a stag antler horn, to summon members of the tribe from around the world to defend Silver Tara. To make matters worse, following the attack in 2000, then Ard Rí Brendan O'Rourke led his pack on a secret mission into the Umbra and haven't been heard from since. At this point, the tribe has effectively given Brendan up for dead and have accepted the leadership of his appointed successor, Bron MacFinn. And so at last we have arrived at the Fianna in the modern Knights. And they are knights fraught with internal tensions. Formerly belonging to the Tuatha De Fin camp, Ard Rí Bron MacFinn has dedicated most of his time as Ard Rí to re-establishing ties to the Changelings. He has spent much of his time in negotiation with the Fae and has even taken a troll as his bodyguard. The High King seems convinced that by re-establishing strong alliances with the Fae, the Fianna will gain an invaluable advantage in the final conflict with the Worm. But the Changelings have ever been unpredictable, more inclined to pursue their own interests. What's more, the recent disappearance of High King David Ardry has thrown the Fae courts into disarray, as a power struggle has emerged between his sister and counselor Morwen and his queen and wife, Ferelith. What's more, Bron's obsession with Fae diplomacy has greatly decreased the respect his tribe mates have for him, as he seems to be focusing on this and neglecting all other duties as Ard Rí. It certainly doesn't help that he is often reluctant to discuss matters with his advisors, keeping his own counsel in a tribe that often expects its leaders to be forthcoming with them. Though many of the elders and traditionalists still support him, a growing number within the tribe, particularly the young and more disaffected, have been turning not to the Ard Rí for leadership, but to his second-in-command, a Lupus Theurge and leader of the Sept of the Tri-Spiral named Son of Moonlight. Born and initially raised in a zoo, Son of Moonlight often looked back on those early years of captivity with hatred, and in part because of this was originally a member of the Mother's Fundamentalists. No one knows what happened next exactly. Son of Moonlight has deigned not to talk about it. He somehow ended up falling in love with a human woman, and has since turned his back on his old human-hating ways. He eventually became leader of the Sept of the Tri-Spiral, and when Black Spiral dancers began emerging in greater numbers in Scotland at the turn of the millennium, rather than deal with the matter himself, Bron MacFinn delegated the task to him. Although it has proved difficult, Son of Moonlight has handled the situation in Scotland well thus far, and has earned a great deal of respect from his fellow tribe mates. While the Ard Rí seems to think strengthening ties with the Fae will best help the Fianna in the War of the Apocalypse, the Taniaste is of the opinion that rather the Fianna should strengthen ties with the other tribes, and has even engaged in secret talks with the Shadow Lord Margrave Yuri Konietzko, who seeks to build a Europe-wide werewolf coalition. These are dangerous nights for the Fianna. Potential conflicts within are no good to the tribe as the minions of the Worm increase the pressure from without. After all, a house or tribe divided against itself cannot stand. And what with the last few thousand years, the Garou have a bad enough track record as it is. If internal tribal divisions are allowed to fester, counting on them to stop the Worm would be like counting on Father Dougal to do a funeral service. Thus, despite Son of Moonlight's reputation, the majority of tribal elders are unwilling to abandon the old ways of doing things. In many ways, the Fianna are the most traditionalistic of the Garou tribes. The elders especially are resistant to any kind of innovation unless it can be proven to be many times better than what has come before. Fianna cairns also reflect this traditionalist mindset in that they are generally very simple. Most Fianna figure that adding extra features to a cairn just clutters it up spiritually, makes it harder to hear Gaia talking to them. Your typical Fianna cairn has, well, a cairn of stones piled up near the center, the skins of various animals caught and killed in honor of the cairn's guardian totem, and a water feature, unless the cairn itself is built near to a body of water. It can be a natural pool, the bank of a river, or a lake. The water feature usually serves many purposes. First, because it's a mirrored surface, it's much easier for Garou to step sideways into the umbra using it. Second, the water has symbolic value, as it is both a giver of life, all living things need to drink, but also a bringer of death, because you can drown in water. What's more, if a Fianna wishes to make sacrifice to the spirits, he will usually do so by tossing an offering into the water. Look all you like, but you will never find what he or she threw in there. So clearly, the spirits are listening. But if Fianna cairns are austere and simplistic, their moots, or tribal gatherings, are wild and elaborate. Even if it's not celebrating one of the 4 festivals, Imbolc, Beltane, Samhain, and Lugnasa, a Fianna moot isn't a proper gathering unless it's got 3 things: song, dance, and drink. Lots and lots of drink, with all the lowering of inhibitions and all that comes from that. In the grim darkness of the modern nights, that is often a great comfort to them. In that sense, the Fianna really do embody the old saying, "Sing, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may be dead." Life and time with loved ones is precious. Enjoy it while you can. Really, whenever a moot or festival goes on, the only Fianna that might have a hard time enjoying themselves are the Philodoxes, because they, in addition to their traditional role as judges and lawkeepers, they also have the thankless task of essentially policing their fellow tribemates' sexuality. First, the Philodox functions as a kind of matchmaker for his tribemates. Especially in the modern nights, with the War of the Apocalypse looming on the horizon, the Garou nation can use every full-blooded werewolf that it can get. And so, in the case of the Fianna, the Philodoxes actually try to determine what pairings of werewolf and kinfolk is most likely to produce said full-blooded Garou. This runs the risk of engendering resentment, as sometimes the kinfolk and werewolf in question don't really feel anything for one another. In the old days, perhaps this could be allowed to slide, but these aren't the old days, and as far as the Fianna elders are concerned, the most important thing their young bloods can do, apart from fighting the worm, is breeding as frequently as possible. The other thankless duty of the Fianna Philodox is making sure their fellow werewolves aren't shagging each other. After all, I think we're pretty clear at this point what the Fianna think of Metis in general, and their own Metis in particular. Even so, despite this vigilance, it happens a lot more frequently than it should. One, because Fianna are often likely to indulge their passions in general, and two, even kinfolk simply can't understand what it is to live as a werewolf and live with the constant war against the worm. But the litany states that Garou shall not mate with Garou. Most of the other commandments of the litany are pretty straightforward as far as the Fianna are concerned. Combat the worm wherever it dwells and whenever it breeds, respect the territory of another, accept an honorable surrender, the first share of the kill for the greatest in station, ye shall not eat the flesh of humans, the veil shall not be lifted, respect those beneath ye, all are of Gaia, the leader may be challenged at any time during peace, the leader may not be challenged during wartime, ye shall take no action that causes a cairn to be violated. Apart from the whole mating thing, there are only two other commandments of the litany that the Fianna have a hard time with. The first being submission to those of higher station. On the one hand, Fianna are generally passionate and unruly. They are not easily led by nature. Secondly, they figure it's actually their job to constantly be testing their leaders and alphas whenever possible. After all, an alpha has to be the best. And how can alphas prove they're the best unless their subordinates challenge them now and again? The other commandment that goes hard for the Fianna is the one that decrees, "Do not suffer thy people to tend thy sickness." They understand the wisdom of the commandment. In the modern nights, werewolves have so much to do as it is. They can't afford to tend to those who will still live but not be able to fight again against the worm. Still, for such tight-knit people as the Fianna often are, it goes against the grain to abandon a family member or a loved one. These strong, almost familial bonds that the Fianna have with one another and with their kinfolk is arguably their tribe's greatest strength. While the Fianna are often pretty bad towards their metis, their relations with their kinfolk, wolf and especially human, are among the strongest in all of the Garou nation. Where most werewolves see the kinfolk as breeding stock, the Fianna see them as family. And the kinfolk tend to reciprocate that affection, which often makes them all the more dedicated to the service of the werewolves and of Gaia. One noteworthy benefit of these close ties is that the Fianna have quite an extensive kinfolk network, and this is especially useful in tracking down young guru that have just undergone the first change. Such youngsters are often still full of rage and quite confused, dangerous to themselves as well as to those around them. All werewolf tribes agree that it's generally a good idea to grab the youngster as quickly as possible and induct them into the ways of Gaia. And the Fianna's kinfolk network are especially good at tracking down and keeping a weather eye on those youngsters that show the potential of being full-blooded guru. These youngsters can then be found and spirited away with the least amount of fuss. They are then handed over to an elder guru of the same auspice in a process known as fostering, where the elder mentors the youngster until it is believed that they are ready to undergo the rite of passage. But why do the Fianna have this strong obsession with family? As they see it, family and loved ones are what makes the fight against the worm worth fighting. The werewolves were made to serve Gaia, but why would the Earth Mother have given them the capacity to love human and wolf alike? Because if you have someone or something you love, you will fight all the harder for it, no matter the odds. A home, a hearth, a family, and a lover to help keep you warm at night. These are the things that make life worth living, that make the fight worth fighting. The rage of the Fianna is a rage in the defense of those who are the most precious to you. It is a rage fueled by the passion in their hearts, in their songs, and in their stories. Werewolf the Apocalypse's famous tagline asks, "When will you rage?" For the Fianna, it's a different question. Not when, but for whom. Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description.